December 23rd, 1988. Orange County, North Carolina. A quartet of friends, 19-year-old Kenneth Dungee, 17-year-old Kenneth Newkirk, 17-year-old Levern Allen, and 17-year-old Darius Bannerman, leave their homes in Greensboro in order to drive to Raleigh to go Christmas shopping. While traveling down Interstate 40, their car is violently run off the road by a blue Monte Carlo containing a white man and a white woman. Kenneth Dungee is killed in the crash, and while his three friends survive, Levern has his right leg amputated. Since the four young men were black, it is speculated that the occupants of the Monte Carlo committed a hate crime, but they cannot be identified, and Kenneth's murder is never solved. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and this week we're going to be exploring an horrific vehicular crime which was featured on Unsolved Mysteries, the 1988 murder of Kenneth Dungee. Since we've entered the month of December and are nearing the Christmas season, I often like to cover holiday-themed cold cases which took place on or around December the 25th, and I've been wanting to do an episode about this story for quite some time. Even though Kenneth Dungee was the only one who wound up dead, there were actually 4 victims in this story, as Kenneth and 3 of his friends, Kenneth Newkirk, Darius Bannerman, and Levern Allen, left together on a road trip to go shopping and buy presents 2 days before Christmas. But as they were traveling down Interstate 40 through Durham and Orange counties, a blue Monte Carlo suddenly popped up and started tailgating them and intentionally ramming their rear bumper at a high rate of speed before the victim's car went off the road and flipped over down an embankment. Kenneth Dungee was killed instantly, and while Kenneth Newkirk, Darius Bannerman, and Levern Allen survived their injuries, Levern had his right leg amputated. According to the survivors and numerous eyewitnesses, the driver of the Monte Carlo was a white male with a white female in the passenger seat, and since all 4 of his victims were black and they did not appear to have any personal connection to the perpetrators, one theory which has been pushed forward is that the whole thing was a hate crime and the motive was nothing more than racism. However, the occupants of the Monte Carlo have still never been identified, and until that happens, we may never know why they did this. Since there isn't a whole lot of information available about this story, today's episode will also be covering another disturbing case from Unsolved Mysteries, which took place along an interstate in North Carolina less than 2 years later. This one involves a woman known only as Debbie, who was abducted and carjacked in Winston-Salem by an unidentified black man, who forced her to drive 120 miles before they pulled over on Interstate 95 near Fayetteville. Debbie was then taken into the woods and sexually assaulted by this man before he fired a shotgun blast into her face and fled the scene in her car, but miraculously, Debbie wound up surviving. Attempts have been made to identify and track down Debbie's attacker, but no charges have ever been filed. You see, in addition to both taking place along North Carolina interstates, one other thing both these crimes have in common is that they've remained unsolved for over 3 decades, but many people hold the opinion that they should have been solved a long time ago. So I'll start this episode off by discussing the murder of Kenneth Dungee before I share my theories and analysis, and then I'll move on to sharing Debbie's case. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Podcast Addict, and more. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, including stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content, as our Patreon page has around 80 exclusive bonus episodes in our archives which are not available on a regular feed. In addition, I wanted to remind everyone that at the end of the month, the Trail Went Cold will be releasing another Q&A episode. If you have a question you would like me to answer on the show, you have 2 more days following this episode's release to send me an email under the subject line Trail Went Cold Q&A to robin.werder@icloud.com. The deadline to send in questions will be just 2 days from now on Friday, December the 13th. I also wanted to announce that this coming Saturday, December the 14th, we'll be holding one of our Unsolved Mysteries live watch marathons in which I screen classic segments from the show and you can watch them and chat with myself and your fellow listeners. It's taking place at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, and if you'd like to join us, you can find the link to our screening room in the show notes, as well as pinned to the top of our social media pages. So with all that out of the way, let us now start off by exploring the murder of Kenneth Dungee. Our story begins in North Carolina in 1988. Our central figures are 4 young African-American men who all live in Greensboro and attend Smith High School. 19-year-old Kenneth Lynn Dungee, 17-year-old Kenneth Newkirk, 17-year-old Levern Allen III, and 17-year-old Darius Bannerman. And to avoid any confusion over 2 of these guys sharing the same first name, I will now be referring to Kenneth Dungee as Kenny and Kenneth Newkirk as Kenneth. The 4 of them are very close friends and all appear to have very bright futures. Kenny is a drafting and engineering student who is planning to start college next fall, and he is also scheduled to be a project leader on the framing of a house for Habitat for Humanity. Much like Kenny, Kenneth has also recently received a scholarship to a local college, which he is hoping to attend next year. Levern is a lifeguard and a member of his high school's Reserve Officers Training Corps, and has just received a scholarship to the United States Air Force Academy. Darius, who happens to be Kenneth's cousin, is a high school basketball star and also plans to continue his post-secondary education. On the afternoon of Friday, December the 23rd, the 4 friends piled into a 1971 Plymouth Duster belonging to Levern's father, as they were planning to make a 90-minute trip to Raleigh in order to do some last-minute Christmas shopping at the Crabtree Valley Mall. Levern got behind the wheel while Darius took the front passenger seat, and Kenny and Kenneth sat in the back. They started heading east on Interstate 40, and after about an hour, they were traveling through Durham County just outside Chapel Hill. When driving through the right lane, Levern looked in the rearview mirror and noticed that a light blue, mid-1970s model Monte Carlo had pulled up directly behind his bumper, and he would later say that it was tailgating him so closely that he couldn't even see their front bumper. Other motorists who saw the Monte Carlo said that it had Georgia license plates and was being driven by a white male who appeared to be in his late 20s and had dirty, stringy brown hair, prominent cheekbones, and a light-colored mustache. A white woman with blonde or reddish hair who appeared to be in her 20s was sitting in the vehicle's passenger seat. While Levern had already been driving between 60 to 65 miles per hour, he tried speeding up to get ahead of the Monte Carlo, but it would speed up in response and remain directly behind their bumper as they reached speeds of around 75 to 80 miles per hour. The vehicle then drove its front end directly into the Duster's rear bumper, which caused the occupants of the car to become very concerned. Levern continued his attempts to speed up and started moving into the left lane and weaving between other cars on the road in an attempt to lose the Monte Carlo, but it continued to follow them. Darius had been napping in the front seat, but was woken up by the activity, and when he looked back and caught a glimpse of the Monte Carlo's driver through the back window, he described him as having an angry and crazed look on his face, as if the group of friends had done something personal to him and he wanted to get revenge. When the Duster returned to the right lane, the Monte Carlo decided to move into the left lane and pull up beside the Duster in order to sideswipe it. The Monte Carlo then went back behind the Duster in order to keep ramming its rear bumper a few more times, and this finally caused Levern to lose control of the Duster. By this point, the 2 cars were about a half-mile east of the Durham County-Orange County line, and the Duster wound up going off the side of the road before it struck an embankment. It then flipped over 3 times and landed in a field nearly 300 feet away from exit 270. According to eyewitnesses, the Monte Carlo came to a stop, and the male driver briefly climbed out to look at the crash scene. His female passenger then yelled at him to get back in the car, and after he did so, the Monte Carlo sped off and fled the scene. Other motorists on the interstate stopped to offer their assistance, and police and paramedics were summoned to the scene. Darius and Kenneth had apparently not been wearing their seatbelts, so they were thrown from the duster during the crash. But since Kenny and Levern were wearing their seatbelts, they remained trapped inside. In fact, Levern wound up being trapped for about 45 minutes until he was pulled out, and he was subsequently airlifted to the Duke University Medical Center in Durham, where he spent the next 3 days undergoing 3 operations and remained in critical condition. Levern ultimately pulled through and survived, but his right leg was injured so badly that it had to be amputated at the thigh. Kenneth suffered a broken left leg and some broken left fingers in the crash, while Darius suffered a broken wrist, a fractured skull, and some facial injuries. But after they were taken to a nearby hospital for treatment, they survived as well. Unfortunately, Kenny was not so lucky, as he was killed instantly during the crash and pronounced dead at the scene. Due to the lack of evidence, the police were initially reluctant to treat the scene as a crime, but the 3 survivors believed they were run off the road on purpose and that the crash was no accident and Kenny was murdered. Since the 2 occupants of the Monte Carlo were white and the 4 occupants of the duster were black, there was even speculation that the whole incident could have been a racially motivated hate crime. Even though numerous eyewitnesses provided a description of the man and the woman and reported that the Monte Carlo had Georgia plates, no one actually took down the vehicle's license number. One of the witnesses who saw the vehicle agreed to be hypnotized to see if he could recall the license number, but even though enough information popped into his head for him to provide a partial plate number, Georgia motor vehicle records did not have a listing for any blue Monte Carlos with that combination of numbers. During the early stages of the investigation, the North Carolina Highway Patrol interviewed at least one potential suspect who hailed from the Atlanta area and reportedly had a father-in-law who owned a Monte Carlo, but he was ultimately ruled out as a suspect. After being contacted by the state chapter of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, North Carolina Governor Jim Martin announced that the state was offering a $5,000 reward for information, leading to the arrest and conviction of the person or persons responsible for the crime. Since there was conflicting information about whether or not the 4 occupants of the duster were wearing their seatbelts during the crash, the North Carolina Highway Patrol asked the 3 survivors if they would be willing to take lie detector tests, but the young men and their parents said no, and investigators decided not to press the issue. Levern spent a month at North Carolina Memorial Hospital in Chapel Hill while he was fitted with an artificial leg, and he was able to leave the hospital on crutches. He learned how to walk unassisted within 3 months, and even got to attend his high school prom without using a cane. In June of 1989, Kenny's sister, Terry Dungee, graduated from Smith High School and became the first recipient of a new scholarship named after her brother, which she was planning to use to attend the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. Darius and Levern graduated and received their high school diplomas as well, but of course, the whole situation was a bittersweet feeling for everyone involved, since they felt Kenny should have graduated alongside them. Even though his injury prevented him from following his dream of attending the Air Force Academy, Levern instead went on to attend the Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University in Blacksburg, Virginia. In preparation for joining the military, Levern had worked hard to keep himself in great physical shape, and he would later say that this probably prevented him from being killed in the crash. Darius became a pre-med student at North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University, and after he graduated from high school, Kenneth became a visual communications major at North Carolina Central University in Durham. Levon Tillman, an 18-year-old high school senior who was friends with the 4 young men, wrote to every media outlet she could think of in order to ask if they would provide coverage of their story, and Unsolved Mysteries eventually responded and agreed to produce an episode which aired on January 31st, 1990. A composite sketch of the unidentified driver was displayed on the show, but even though their telecenter wound up receiving nearly 300 calls, none of them brought the case any closer to a resolution. In 1993, Levern did an interview with the Greensboro News and Record in which he revealed that after his freshman year at Virginia Tech, he decided to drop out, since he felt the mental and physical strain of trying to navigate himself around campus with an artificial leg was just too much to handle. After moving back home to his parents' house in Greensboro, he decided to attend Guilford Technical Community College while working part-time at a bookstore and interning at a local recording studio. Levern expressed his frustration that the suspect responsible for the crash had still not been identified, and he felt that law enforcement had done little to find him. I'll talk more about this momentarily, but it sounds like in spite of their ordeal, Levern, Kenneth, and Darius all went on to start families and have successful careers, and have managed to live good lives. But they still want justice for their deceased friend, and unfortunately, after 36 years, Kenneth Dungee's murder continues to remain unsolved. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. So I vividly remember watching the Unsolved Mystery segment about this story when it originally aired on television, and being 11 years old at the time, I was pretty perturbed by the idea that these 4 young men were on their way to have a fun Christmas shopping trip until some maniac just decided to run them off the road for unknown reasons. However, I did feel that it was probably only a matter of time before this case was solved, and I'm sure many other people watching felt the same way. We had a number of eyewitnesses who saw the crash and provided a description of the 2 suspects and their vehicle, so now that the case was getting exposure on national television, surely someone watching would know who these people were, yet here we are in 2024, and not only is the case unsolved, but no one has ever been publicly named as a suspect or person of interest. I guess it's possible that law enforcement might have an idea who the perpetrator was, but just lacked the evidence to make an arrest. But since they have not commented on this case for decades, I have no idea where this whole thing stands. It's just rotten luck that we have a number of motorists who saw the blue Monte Carlo and even confirmed that it had Georgia plates, yet no one actually took down the license number, which could have led to this case being solved in days, if not hours. What's also remarkable is that if this was some sort of hate crime, and the driver of the Monte Carlo intentionally ran the duster off the road simply because it contained 4 black men, then you would think that they would have bragged about this at some point and not kept their mouth shut all this time. Hell, if the whole thing was the male driver's idea and the female passenger did not expect something like this to happen, it is surprising that she's managed to stay silent and not attempted to clear her conscience. But on the other hand, if the driver was making an intentional attempt to run the duster off the road in order to cause death or serious injury, their most logical response would have been to flee the area as quickly as possible. Yet witnesses confirmed that the Monte Carlo pulled over and the man briefly climbed out to look at the crash scene. Considering what a huge risk that was and how lucky they were that no one took down their license number, this could be interpreted as a sign that they did not expect the duster to crash like that, so they needed to see what they did. Once they realized that they may have potentially cost someone their life, they panicked and hightailed it out of there. In fact, perhaps the reason the Monte Carlo has never been tracked down is because they took the step of destroying or disposing of the vehicle shortly thereafter. I suppose the only good thing about this horrible tragedy is that even though Kenneth Dungee lost his life and Levern Allen lost his leg, and all 3 survivors experienced a lot of trauma over the situation, it sounds like they managed to persevere and went on to live very good lives. We know that Levern, Darius Bannerman, and Kenneth Newkirk graduated high school and attended university, and in 2005, Darius, posting under the username D-Man, left a comment on the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum. He revealed that he was now married and had a 1-year-old child, and had become a manager at a successful pharmaceutical company, and he also confirmed that Kenneth and Levern had also both gotten married, with Kenneth now working as a computer engineer and Levern now working as a graphic designer. In 2019, Darius left another comment on the profile page for this case at the official Unsolved Mysteries website in order to confirm that he, Kenneth, and Levern were all still living successful and fulfilling lives with their families, and he also wanted to dispel speculation from some of the commenters there that the 4 young men may have provoked the driver of the Monte Carlo in some way. Indeed, the survivors have always maintained that they have no idea who the people inside the Monte Carlo were and had no interaction with them until the vehicle suddenly pulled up behind the rear bumper. While I suppose it's possible that Levern could have unknowingly done something to piss off the driver and send him into a road rage, such as cutting him off without realizing it, there is zero reason to believe these guys aren't telling the truth, particularly since there were numerous motorists on the interstate who could verify that the Monte Carlo just seemed to start tailgating the Duster completely out of nowhere and continue to harass them for the next few miles. I think all these assumptions about there being more to the story probably stem from the fact that Levern, Kenneth, and Darius were asked to take polygraphs following the crash, which they all refused to do. I can't say I disagree with their decision, since polygraphs were unreliable, so if they did nothing wrong and were completely telling the truth about what happened, there's always the chance that one or more of their tests could have registered a false positive result and created unnecessary complications for the investigation. It sounds like investigators requested the lie detector tests because there were contradictory accounts about whether or not Kenneth and Darius were wearing their seatbelts, but I think they became frustrated over the fact that law enforcement almost seemed to be more focused on poking potential holes in their stories rather than catching the perpetrators. While a very memorable composite sketch of the driver was circulated during the Unsolved Mystery segment, a completely different sketch was actually circulated by the North Carolina media during the earliest coverage of the case, and this one was actually drawn by one of the survivors rather than law enforcement. The fact of the matter is that by all accounts, Kenny, Kenneth, Levern, and Darius were each considered to be fine, upstanding young men with bright futures who excelled academically and had no history of run-ins with the law or ever getting into serious trouble. So they definitely deserve the benefit of the doubt rather than any attempt at victim blaming. If you look through the earliest news accounts of this case, Kenny's death is not initially referred to as a murder or a homicide, as I think law enforcement was willing to consider the possibility that the whole thing was a tragic accident, and even if the driver of the Monte Carlo caused the crash, he had no intention of killing anybody. But even so, they made a calculated choice to flee the scene of an accident, and if you do that after someone's been killed or seriously injured, that's still a major crime. Now, I know it's tempting to believe this was a hate crime, but the fact of the matter is that we don't know for sure. For all we know, this could have simply been a case of unbridled road rage, and the Duster wound up being targeted because it just happened to be in the driver's way, but the race of the four men inside had no bearing on his actions. However, after the Monte Carlo started tailgating the Duster, I know that Levern tried getting out of their way by going back and forth between different lanes, but the driver never attempted to pass them and made an intentional choice to stay on the rear. And even though Levern drove up to speeds equaling around 75 to 80 miles per hour, this guy still kept harassing him and slamming into the Duster's bumper, so I don't think this was just a matter of Levern driving too slow for his taste. I've also considered the possibility that this was a case of mistaken identity, since Darius said that the driver seemed to have a crazed look on his face, as if he and his friends had done something personal to him and he wanted to hurt them out of revenge. So it does make me wonder if the driver had a vendetta or a previous encounter with someone driving a completely different Plymouth Duster and he took out his aggression on the wrong car. When the driver pulled over and climbed out of the vehicle and looked at the crash scene and saw the victims, perhaps he came to the horrifying realization that he ran the wrong people off the road. Still, we know the Monte Carlo had Georgia plates, and this incident took place near Chapel Hill. The Georgia-North Carolina state line is about 300 miles west of this spot, and the Monte Carlo was heading east at the time, but could they have turned around and returned to Georgia following the crash? Well, even though no one has ever been publicly named as a suspect or person of interest by law enforcement, another poster at the aforementioned Unsolved Mysteries message board, who went under the username Miss X, started a very interesting thread about this case in April of 2003. She said she was looking for a copy of the original Unsolved Mysteries segment because she remembered having seen it before and now believed she knew who the perpetrator might be. She wrote, quote, "It showed a sketch of the white killer, and I remember thinking that he looked exactly like a guy my brother knew, but I never gave much more thought to it. I live on a little island, and this had happened somewhere in the States, I think, so I thought, no way, it couldn't possibly be him. Years later, my brother got drunk, and told me that his friend had told him he had been on Unsolved Mysteries, Wanted for Murder. He told my brother that he had lived in many places in the US and Canada, had robbed 2 banks, and had run those kids off the road on their prom night. My brother said he didn't know anything else about it and has kept his mouth shut tightly to this day. His friend, the one I believe is the killer, has been in and out of jail his whole life for assault, fraud, burglary, and countless other charges. I can't tell you his name because I will fear for my safety. Monte Carlo, my brother's friend did own a Monte Carlo, but he also owned a lot of different cars. He used to steal them." End quote. Obviously, Miss X may have misremembered the part about kids being run off the road on prom night, since that's not what happened here, but otherwise, she sounded like she genuinely wanted to find out if this friend of her brother may have been responsible for the crime. Well, years later, in September of 2010, Levern Allen left a comment on the same message board thread asking Mrs. X to get in touch with him. Miss X later started posting again under another username, PHMCAK, and confirmed that she had shared this information about her brother's friend with the police, but nothing ever came of it. But she also mentioned getting to rewatch the Unsolved Mystery segment, and after seeing the composite sketch of the suspect, she became more convinced that it might be her brother's friend. I mean, for all we know, since law enforcement has never publicly commented on the situation, it's possible that they already looked into this individual and ruled him out as a suspect. I think the main reason I'm putting so much emphasis on these message board comments is because, as far as I know, investigators have not had any serious leads in the case in quite some time, and the last news articles I've seen published about it were way back during the mid-1990s. And what about the female passenger from the Monte Carlo? Curiously, even though she was seen by eyewitnesses, no composite sketch has ever been created or circulated for her, so perhaps no one got a good enough look at the woman. We still don't know if she was all in on her companion's plan to run the duster off the road, or if she had no idea he was going to do this and never expected anyone to get hurt. If it's the latter scenario, it is surprising that she has managed to keep her mouth shut all these years. Both the man and the woman were described as being in their mid to late 20s, which means that if they are still alive today, they would now be in their late 50s or early 60s. There is still a chance to bring them to justice, but this just isn't one of those crimes you can solve via DNA evidence. If Miss X's story is true, it's very possible that the perpetrator has openly bragged about this crime, and there are other people out there who know the truth about what happened. 36 years is just way too long for Kenneth Dungee's loved ones, as well as the 3 survivors, to have gone without answers, so if you happen to have any information about this crime, please contact the appropriate authorities. And now let's move on to our next case. Our second story also takes place in North Carolina, this time in 1990. Our next victim is a 43-year-old woman who lives in the town of Rural Hall, which is located in Forsyth County and borders the city of Winston-Salem. Now, I'll state right up front that if you search through old news articles about this case, you'll be able to find out her real name, but when she appeared on Unsolved Mysteries, she asked that her name not be used, and they instead referred to her as Debbie. I know that nearly 35 years have passed, but the perpetrator has never been caught, and the survivor is still alive and has not publicly revealed her identity, so I'll continue to respect her privacy and call her Debbie as well. At around 2:30 p.m. on March the 22nd, Ron Knight and Chris Dew, a pair of state troopers with the North Carolina Highway Patrol, pulled over their respective vehicles at an off-ramp along Interstate 95, located in Cumberland County, just 3 miles north of Fayetteville. As the 2 men were chatting, they suddenly saw a woman stumbling out of the woods about 75 yards away, and she appeared to have blood on her shoulders. She then headed in the trooper's direction before she stumbled to the ground, and it became apparent that she was seriously injured as there was a gaping wound on the left side of her face. The troopers immediately called for an ambulance, which soon arrived and transported the woman to Highsmith Rainey Memorial Hospital in Fayetteville, where they determined that she had been shot in the face with a 12-gauge double-barreled shotgun, which completely shattered her left jaw. In addition to her upper and lower jaw, the shotgun blast had blown off over half of her lips, as well as her teeth and gums. After she was rushed into reconstructive surgery, the woman miraculously pulled through, but since she could not speak and was not carrying any identification, it took about 10 hours for the police to figure out who she was. When her condition stabilized, the woman was able to write down her mother's name and telephone number, and when police checked it out, they learned that her family had already reported her missing. Like I just mentioned, I'm going to be referring to the woman as Debbie, but she was a 43-year-old divorcee with 3 children who lived in Rural Hall, over 120 miles northwest of Fayetteville. Detectives from the Winston-Salem Police Department soon traveled to the hospital to interview Debbie, who had her jaw wired shut and had separate tubes in her throat and stomach. Even though she was unable to speak, she managed to write down a detailed account of how she wound up in Cumberland County, as well as provide a description of the person who attacked her. According to Debbie, on the morning of March the 22nd, she had left work for a doctor's appointment, and at around 11:40 a.m., she drove her gray station wagon to the First Union National Bank in Winston-Salem in order to make a cash withdrawal. However, after she climbed back into her vehicle, she was accosted by a black man carrying a sawed-off double-barreled shotgun. She described him as being in his mid-30s and being between 5'6" and 5'10", and weighing around 150 to 160 pounds. He had close-cropped hair and wore a dark navy blue size 42 pea jacket, a blue short-sleeve button-up shirt, faded blue jeans, and an off-white baseball cap. He forced himself into Debbie's station wagon through the front passenger side door, and after pointing his shotgun at her, he demanded that she drive away. They traveled about 3 miles before the gunman ordered Debbie to stop at a liquor store. He took Debbie's keys and told her he was going inside, but that he would keep a close eye on her and kill everyone in the store if she tried to run away. The man then entered the establishment and purchased a bottle of whiskey while constantly looking out at Debbie through the front window, leaving her too terrified to try anything. After the man left and climbed back into the station wagon, he ordered Debbie to leave the city and drive towards North Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, while he provided the directions. He soon told her to head east on Interstate 40, and for nearly 3 hours, Debbie experienced pure terror while her captor drank his bottle of whiskey in the front seat. Debbie said there were long passages of time when he didn't say anything, but when he did speak, he was verbally abusive towards Debbie and threatened her. His behavior gradually became more erratic, and at one point, he bragged about having once killed a man in New York. They eventually arrived in Greensboro, where the man told Debbie to get off I-40 and head south on U.S. Route 421 before they wound up on Interstate 95. When they were 3 miles north of Fayetteville, Debbie was ordered to pull over by the side of the road, and the assailant immediately climbed out and dragged Debbie into a nearby wooded area. In a cruel twist of fate, it turned out that almost immediately afterward, Ron Knight, one of the state troopers who later found Debbie, was traveling north on the opposite side of the interstate. He noticed Debbie's station wagon and was in the midst of circling back to check it out, but a speeder just happened to appear and head south on I-95, so Knight pursued that vehicle instead. While this was going on, Debbie's kidnapper forced her down an embankment in the woods, but even though she attempted to make a break for it, he soon caught up with her. He proceeded to punch her in the face and hit her in the head with his weapon before sexually assaulting her, and fired a shotgun blast into her face. Since Debbie's station wagon was no longer parked by the road by the time Debbie made it out of the woods, the perpetrator had likely stolen it, and he also took Debbie's money, wristwatch, and a small ring. An APB was put out on Debbie's vehicle, and the day after the crime took place, the station wagon was found abandoned 300 miles away in Hamilton County, Florida, just south of the Georgia border. When the authorities performed a search of the wooded area where Debbie was attacked, they managed to turn up a dark blue pea jacket, which was presumably left behind by the assailant, as well as a pair of brown, cloth cotton work gloves, which Debbie said he had worn. Since the jacket and the gloves seemed to have a strong odor of some sort of petroleum product, investigators wondered if he had a job which required him to work around and handle petroleum, such as a fuel truck driver or a mechanic. In total, Debbie had to spend 103 days in various hospitals to undergo extensive plastic surgery as doctors attempted to restore her shattered jaw. The First Union National Bank where Debbie had been abducted from also set up an account under her name to accept donations for her, and Debbie's family also helped raise money for a reward fund. Much like with the previous case I covered, then North Carolina Governor Jim Martin contributed $5,000 to the reward fund on behalf of the state, and the reward wound up totaling around $16,500. On December the 5th, 1990, 8.5 months after Debbie's attack took place, Unsolved Mysteries agreed to produce a segment about her story. By that point, Debbie had regained the ability to speak and agreed to be interviewed on the show, though, like I mentioned earlier, she did not want to use her real name, and her interview was filmed in silhouette in order to hide her face. At the end of the segment, Robert Stack revealed that police had physical evidence which would allow them to positively identify Debbie's attacker if he could be located. But even though a composite sketch of the suspect was circulated and around 1,000 calls were made to the show's telecenter, none of these tips led to him being identified. In May of 1993, an article about the case was published in the Greensboro News and Record, which revealed that after undergoing 20 operations, doctors had managed to rebuild Debbie's lips, as well as her upper and lower jaw, and done skin grafts to her tongue, though it was reported that she would still need to undergo at least 4 more operations in the future. When she was originally released from the hospital, Debbie wore a surgical mask and would not even let her own children see her face. She kept the mask on for months until she finally decided to take it off and go out in public on a trip to the grocery store. Debbie's medical bills wound up totaling more than $250,000, and while insurance covered most of the costs, she still required assistance from other people who helped raise thousands of dollars for her. Debbie was interviewed for the News and Record article and said that even though she had suffered through bouts of depression following her ordeal, she was now in good spirits. She had recently graduated from High Point University in Winston-Salem with a grade point average of 3.92 after majoring in psychology, and she was hoping to become a counselor in order to help other victims of violent crime. Debbie stated, quote, "God saved me for a reason. I just felt like it was something he wanted me to do, to work with these people, particularly women who have been victimized, to let them know that they can make it." End quote. While Debbie has gone on to live a fulfilling life, she has never seen her attacker get brought to justice. Over the past several years, online sleuths have pointed towards a currently incarcerated offender who seems like a very promising suspect, but it's unclear if he has ever been investigated by law enforcement. I'll be sharing more details about this suspect in a little while, but officially, it appears that the man responsible for the attack on Debbie has never been identified. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. So I'm sure most Unsolved Mysteries fans will tell you that the segment about the abduction and attempted murder of Debbie is one of the most disturbing things the show ever produced. The reenactments of these events are pretty unsettling, particularly when they show the unhinged perpetrator chasing Debbie through the woods before he assaults and shoots her, as the whole sequence is shot in slow motion and has the feel of a surreal nightmare. What really bothers people is just how random and illogical this whole crime was, as there's nothing to indicate that Debbie's attacker knew her personally, as he may have just been lying in wait for someone to carjack at the First Union National Bank, and when Debbie arrived there, he decided she was an ideal target. However, while it's not uncommon for criminals to select random victims in order to rob and sexually assault them, it's not often that they force them to drive 120 miles before their attack takes place, and also spend the journey downing an entire bottle of whiskey. During our Unsolved Mysteries interview, Debbie made it sound like the road trip was pure hell, as the man grew progressively more angry, illogical, and verbally abusive as he became more intoxicated, and Debbie realized that she was not going to be able to reason with him. Even though this man bragged about once having killed a man in New York, some people have taken his purchase and consumption of the whiskey as a sign that he had never done anything like this before, and he needed to get drunk in order to work up the will to kill Debbie. It's been reported that Debbie made a large cash withdrawal at the bank before she was abducted, and while the man later stole her money, it's never been publicly released just how much the withdrawal was. Regardless, I get the sense that robbery was not the primary motive for this crime, and I have no idea why the perpetrator felt compelled to stop at that particular spot along Interstate 95 just outside Fayetteville before he went through the act of assaulting and attempting to murder Debbie. It's been reported that when he first abducted Debbie, he ordered her to drive towards North Myrtle Beach and he would provide her with the directions. But if he wanted to drive there from Winston-Salem, the quickest route would have been to head south on Interstate 74 rather than east on Interstate 40. Due to the distance he traveled, I get the sense that the attacker was not a Winston-Salem resident because after he stole Debbie's station wagon, he abandoned it in Hamilton County, Florida, which is about 300 miles away from where he assaulted her and 420 miles away from Winston-Salem. But if that was his ultimate destination, it would have made much more sense for him to immediately travel south, as the trip east towards Fayetteville seemed like an unnecessary detour. I can see why this guy would carjack someone if he needed a ride to Florida, but that doesn't explain the sheer rage and brutality of what he did to Debbie. I mentioned earlier that if you search hard enough online, you can find Debbie's real name, though I've elected not to share it on this episode. But I will mention that Debbie is on social media and she is still alive today in her late 70s. I've also seen a fairly recent photograph of her, and even though she still has damage to her face, her multiple surgeries did a remarkable job at reconstructing it. Even though Debbie spoke with a slurred speech during her appearance on Unsolved Mysteries, it's pretty much a miracle she was able to regain the ability to speak at all. One of the most haunting moments from the segment is when a Winston-Salem police detective describes his initial interview with Debbie in the hospital and says that she had the most severe injury he had ever seen for a victim who survived. While Debbie was recovering, all of the mirrors were removed from her room, and her family was advised that she should not look at any reflections of herself to see the full extent of the injuries to her face until she was in the right frame of mind and had a doctor by her side. However, Debbie eventually wound up catching a glimpse of her face by complete accident when a friend of hers sent a Mylar balloon to her room and she saw a reflection of herself on it. In spite of all this trauma, it sounds like Debbie has gone on to live a good life these past 3 decades, though I'm sure it couldn't have been easy for her to keep looking over her shoulder, wondering if the man who did this was still out there. Much like the previous case we profiled, there is no real mystery about what happened, as we have a living survivor who was able to provide a full account of the crime. What we don't know is the identity of the perpetrator or their motive, but I suppose the obvious question is, how come this guy has never been identified? I previously shared that near the end of the Unsolved Mystery segment, Robert Stack said that the police had physical evidence which would allow them to positively identify Debbie's attacker if he could be located. Since this was the early 1990s, and DNA analysis was still a relatively new thing in criminal investigations, DNA evidence was not specifically mentioned, but the implication seems to be that the attacker left his DNA behind when he sexually assaulted Debbie. However, as I'm sure you know, genetic genealogy has played a huge role in solving a number of cold cases these past several years by matching DNA evidence to the offender. And this doesn't just apply to murders, as the perpetrators of a number of unsolved rapes have also been identified and charged with their crimes thanks to genetic genealogy. So if there is DNA in this case, how come it's never been linked to anyone? After all, it was such a violent crime that it's reasonable to assume that the perpetrator has spent time in prison at some point and had his DNA entered into the system. Well, now would be a good time to talk about a very compelling suspect who has spent the past 3 decades behind bars for a crime which is remarkably similar to this one. I'll state right up front that law enforcement has never named this man as a suspect or a person of interest, or even mentioned him at all in relation to the investigation, but online sleuths have frequently brought him up during discussions about this case. On the morning of September the 16th, 1992, 2.5 years after Debbie's attack, 36-year-old Chrissy Gallagher went missing after driving away from her home in Paughtown, an unincorporated community next to Winston-Salem. Later that day, an unidentified black man attempted to use her credit cards at separate locations in Winston-Salem and Greensboro, and he also tried to cash one of her checks at a bank in the town of Sanford. 2 days later, a state trooper spotted Chrissy's missing car nearly 200 miles away in Columbus County, and when he pulled the vehicle over, it was being driven by another woman. It turned out that she was the girlfriend of a 25-year-old black man named Ernest Ray Cherry, who hailed from Winston-Salem and was subsequently taken into custody. In 1985, Cherry had been convicted of armed robbery and received a 15-year prison sentence, but due to prison overcrowding issues, he was released after serving only 3 years. He was soon identified as the man who'd been using Chrissy's credit cards, and the morning after Cherry's arrest, Chrissy was found in a wooded area near Fayetteville. It turned out that Cherry had carjacked Chrissy from a parking lot on the morning of September the 16th and placed her inside the trunk while he drove around to various locations to use her credit cards and attempt to cash one of her checks. After traveling down North Carolina Highway 87, he got off onto a deserted dirt road in Cumberland County and pulled over about 6 miles south of Fayetteville. He then removed Chrissy from the trunk before he sexually assaulted, beat, and strangled her in a wooded area and left her for dead before he drove off. Remarkably, even though Chrissy remained incapacitated at the same spot for 3 days, she was still alive when police found her, and she managed to pull through and positively identify Cherry as her attacker. Cherry wound up being charged with attempted first-degree murder, 2 counts of rape, assault with a deadly weapon with intent to kill, inflicting serious injury, first-degree kidnapping, and armed robbery. And after agreeing to plead guilty to these charges, he received a sentence of life imprisonment plus 120 years. Cherry is still incarcerated to this day, and once again, even though law enforcement has never publicly mentioned him in conjunction with Debbie's case, I'm sure you can see a ton of similarities with the abduction, rape, and attempted murder of Chrissy Gallagher. Cherry matches the description of Debbie's attacker, and if you look at photographs of him, he does have a resemblance to the suspect's composite sketch. I'd also be curious to know if some of the other clues in this case might apply to Cherry. For instance, the jacket and work gloves that the attacker left behind after they assaulted Debbie had the smell of petroleum on them, and I wonder if Cherry had a job at that time which involved working with petroleum. But the most important similarity between these 2 crimes is that they involve a black man carjacking a white woman from a parking lot in Winston-Salem, making an attempt to rob them, traveling over 100 miles away to a wooded area near Fayetteville, and then raping and attempting to murder their victim there before leaving them for dead and fleeing the scene in the victim's stolen car. The key difference is that Debbie's attacker abandoned her car in Florida, whereas Cherry allowed his girlfriend to drive Chrissy Gallagher's car, which is what led to him being caught. But otherwise, the MO in both these crimes is strikingly similar. Since Debbie was forced to drive such a great distance before she was attacked, and her car was abandoned in Florida, I was initially inclined to believe that her assailant was not a Winston-Salem resident. However, Ernest Ray Cherry was a Winston-Salem resident, but he traveled a great distance to Cumberland County to attack Chrissy, and his girlfriend was found driving Chrissy's car in Columbus County, which is near the North Carolina-South Carolina border. So maybe he developed a system of abducting his victims from Winston-Salem, traveling a great distance in order to harm them, and then circling back to return home, as this lessened the chances of the crimes being linked back to him. All that being said, the attack on Chrissy Gallagher was a pretty big story in North Carolina when it happened, so I have to think that at some point, law enforcement has looked into potential connections between Cherry and Debbie's case, and perhaps they ruled him out relatively quickly. After all, Cherry was arrested in September of 1992, and Debbie did an interview with the Greensboro News and Record in May of 1993, but there was no mention of Cherry or any other potential suspects during this interview, and I have no idea if Debbie was ever shown a photograph of Cherry and asked if he was her attacker. And of course, now that Cherry is serving a life sentence in prison, his DNA should be in the system, so I'm really curious to know if anyone has used genetic genealogy or attempted to compare Cherry's DNA to the physical evidence from Debbie's case. Cherry just seems like such a perfect suspect that I still have to wonder if law enforcement has already looked into this angle and cleared him a long time ago. At the very least, Cherry has spent the past 3 decades behind bars and will remain there for the rest of his life, so if he was Debbie's attacker, at least we can take comfort in knowing that he will never harm anyone else. Given the passage of time, I think that even if Cherry is positively identified as the man responsible for this crime, I'm not sure if they would bother to charge him or put him on trial, since he's going to remain in prison anyway. But at least it would give Debbie some peace, knowing that her assailant is no longer out there. So if you happen to have any information about the attack on Debbie, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. And once again, we're going to be releasing another Q&A episode near the end of this month. So if you have a question you would like me to answer on the show, please send me an email under the subject line, Trail Went Cold Q&A, to robin.warder@icloud.com. The deadline to send in questions will be just 2 days after this episode's release on Friday, December the 13th. Also, one final reminder that this coming Saturday, December the 14th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, we'll be holding one of our Unsolved Mysteries live watch marathons in which I screen classic segments from the show, and you can watch them and chat with myself and your fellow listeners. If you'd like to join us, you can find the link to our screening room in our show notes and pinned to the top of our social media pages. Once again, it's taking place this coming Saturday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, and we hope to see you there. Now, the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past 6 years, our Patreon page has released around 80 exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available in our archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, I released an episode about a final appeal case from Unsolved Mysteries, the 1983 wrongful conviction of Tony Miller, who spent nearly 9 years in prison after being falsely accused of robbing an Arby's restaurant and shooting a police officer. I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chili, in which myself and one of my co-hosts, Jules, discuss another case from Unsolved Mysteries, the 1994 murder of David Cox. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have nearly 70 of these commentary tracks in our archives. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Josh T., Mackenzie, and Marissa B. Thank you all so much for your support. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit and the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum, the latter of which has a lot of interesting comments about the Kenneth Dungee case. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Podcast Addict, or whatever your favorite podcasting platform is. So have yourselves a great week, and join us next Wednesday for one final Christmas-themed episode of The Trail Went Cold.